great opportunity because Luke, who's one of the best artists in the country in new media, is in town because he's got a big show coming up. Actually, it's already on exhibit at the Minnesota Street Gallery. It's part of a group show there. And when I heard that he was going to be around, I said, you got to come to campus, give us a talk, and tell us what's going on in New York. So, and he's extremely qualified to do that. He's been in New York for some 25 years. Yep. He's got some Pennsylvania roots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pittsburgh.
And Pittsburgh roots. He has he did a lot of education at Columbia. He's got a PhD in music composition. He's been doing media arts with all kinds of media, video and machinery, lighting, all kinds of things for a long time. He's been associated with the both Columbia, NYU's ITP Center there, and then most recently been the really driving force behind NYU's move into Brooklyn with the Polytechnic Institute. There's a merger, you may have heard, about a year ago, and a huge donation, $100 million donation to form this new school. That's very exciting, and I really think of it as a counterpart, very close counterpart to what we do here, both at Jacobs, and sort of a combination of Jacobs, BC&M, in its spirit, in that it's really about being an avant-garde across many disciplines, connected with engineers and scientists, artists, thinkers across the board. And so you're going to be hearing a lot more about this. They have this big new, huge building in Brooklyn, huge amount of activity and excitement, connections also with all kinds of other programs around Brooklyn. So just keep an eye out for that. Hopefully it'll give us a little taste of it. But he'll also be talking about his own work as an artist, as a composer. He's done some amazing projects with the Democratic National Convention. Where he did a big installation there. I'm not talking about politics today. He worked in Seoul, Sundance, Smithsonian, all around the world, Spain, Switzerland. He's really an international acclaimed artist. He does something that I love. He calls time-lapse phonography, which he'll hopefully mention what that's all about. And he also is a superb coder, and he's done work with Cycling 74, which is based here in San Francisco, doing Max MSP, and he actually is an author, I guess the primary author of Jitter. Co-author of Jitter.
There's a bunch of us. Yeah.
So he's a real thing across the board. So please welcome Luke Dubois.
Thanks for having me, Ken. This is going to be fun. What are all of you studying, the students here? What are you guys studying?
Should we just sit down online?
Yeah, whatever. Or if you're all doing the same thing, you can answer in unison. It doesn't matter.
Industrial engineering.
Industrial engineering, okay.
Architecture and computer science.
Architecture and computer science.
I'm at the School of Information, but I focus on like human-computer interactions and like different material representations of data.
Yeah, we're both PhDs there.
Oh, very cool. Very cool.
Mechanical engineering.
You're a mechanical engineer. Is this part of the engineering school, or is it more complicated?
Oh, yeah.
than that? It's more complicated. Okay.
Sorry, we didn't explain.
No.
This building just went open a year ago.
Oh,
This
very
is the
cool.
Art Design Institute.
Very cool. Cool. So I guess that's awesome. So these are all interesting kind of hybrid things, and I'm kind of a hybrid person, so I think this will be kind of a fun conversation. The first thing I always tell people about me is that I flunked out of engineering school. So this is a good place to start. I flunked out of engineering school at Columbia University. And this is going to sound really ironic, and it kind of is. I flunked out of engineering school because I fell in love with a machine. And this is a machine. This is a thing called the RCA Mark II synthesizer. And it's as big as it looks. It would be about the size of this wall. And it lives in a building at Columbia University that is not on the main campus. It lives in a building on 125th Street where Columbia University developed the Manhattan Project. And it's up there because it was the only building Columbia had with enough power for it. And it's like 486 vacuum tubes, right? Just kind of bolted to the floor. And it's a synthesizer, except it's not the first synthesizer. It's not even like the first interesting synthesizer, but it is sort of kind of one of the first like sequencers. So the way it would work is he would write music on paper tape, kind of like a player piano, right? So you would like punch holes in a spool, hit this button or this button, and it would play. And then it would make you, right off this guy's left shoulder is a shellac record lathe that would make you a record, right? And it makes 4 notes at once, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it would sort of do its thing. And this thing was built as part of a very elaborate con job between these two fellows. This is a guy named Milton Babbitt, who's a professor of composition at Princeton. This is a guy named Vladimir Ussachevsky, who's a professor of composition at Columbia. And they basically talked the Radio Corporation of America into giving them $250,000 to build this machine. And they said, look, if you build this machine to our specifications, within 20 years it'll replace the symphony orchestra. And RCA at the time was sort of like the Clear Channel of its day, or iHeartRadio, or whatever these people call themselves now, right? So they owned radio stations all over America, and in the post-war period, what that meant was they also had unionized symphony orchestras on staff at all these radio stations. So RCA was like, oh my God, we get to get rid of these people with this thing. Sign us up, right? And of course it didn't happen, right? I'll play you, I got about 30 seconds of sound out of it in 1997 before it took out the power on the whole floor. This is what it sounds like. It's not bad. It's still in tune after all these years. Yeah, it makes white noise too. Right? I'll make it noise. It's pretty cool, right? And what happened was, this thing was sort of designed as a way to, do these really amazing things that, humans couldn't play. The whole premise of this machine was it could make music more accurately with higher degree of complexity than your violinist could, right? Which is maybe a problem. But, yeah.
Question. What would be the relationship to the Moog synthesizer and these analog,
This is before, right? So this is mid-50s.
I see, that's
Right? So what happened, so this was obsolete within 10 years, right? Because some smart guy came along and invented something called a transistor, right? So this whole thing, so the Buchla, which is what I played, so this thing was sort of installed in this thing was sort of going live 1957, they built it 1955. By the early 60s, right, there were these other things, right? So there's work Bob Moog did, and then, this guy who just passed away, who was a San Franciscan, created his own synthesizer, right? This is something called a Buchla. This is what I played live. And this thing is like a tabletop. It's maybe the size of that table and can do everything that machine could do and more, right? So the whole thing got scaled down. And this was Don Buchla was a really fascinating guy. These instruments were designed to really kind of blow the lid off of what was possible in terms of like expressivity in electronic music. So it's almost the opposite. This is the synth I worked on in grad school. I'm trying to find a keyboard. Here we go. So like unlike the RCA was all about precision, right, and complexity. Buchla's synthesizers were all about expressivity. And so one of the things that Buchla, this is the photo I'm looking for, decided really early on is that the Western keyboard is fascist, right? And so he refused to use sort of Western piano-style keyboard systems, interfaces in his synthesizers until very, very late, until basically the market forced him to in the early 1980s.
What fascist?
Tuning systems. So what he did instead was his keyboards were undifferentiated touch strips where you could tune the voltage continuously for every key. So you could tune this to a non-Western musical scale, you could just tune it to like the first 16 notes of the Star Spangled Banner, you could tune it to whatever the hell you wanted, right? It also put out control voltage pressure based on the area of contact, so you could just use it as like a vibrato box. You could put your finger on it and go, right, depending on how you pressed, right? And it was like a very different thing. And so there was this kind of like A team and B team where you had folks like Bob Moog, and a guy like Alan Pearson, ARP, made this thing called like the ARP 2600, if you've ever seen any of these things. We use normal keyboards, and we're sort of marketing to rock musicians and jazz musicians and blues musicians and anybody who wanted a synthesizer as a kind of replacement for what would have been like an electric organ. And then on the other side of the house, you have Buchla, and then you have this guy up in Boston named Serge Cherepnik, who sort of were trying to make more expressive tools.
Well, I mean, Buchla's coming out of the Harry Part sort of experimental music scene, so
That's
I
right.
don't think he'd call necessarily what he probably would call it fascist. But having known Dr. Minzley, what he meant was that it was limiting in the sense that
Yeah.
it forced you into the Western canon.
Right.
And he wanted the sort of 60s people to do something other than that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, the thing is, those keyboards, the irony of those things is like, you know, like if you play an ARP, right, like that thing doesn't work either. You know what I mean? It's like, they're
Depends
not.
on your definition of work. But
Right. But I mean, in the sense that if you're gonna lock it into a tuning schema,
Those things are hard to tune. The
Those
Tom
things are hard to
O'Reilly
tune.
course is another legendary impossible to tune.
right. So a better thing to do is maybe say, you know, I got zero, you know, I got a voltage range, and you do whatever you want, right? So that's all. That was what I always thought was sort of interesting about these. So this is what I did at Columbia, was I restored and performed on these synthesizers. I restored and performed on Buchlas and Serge synthesizers. But at a certain point, they stopped working, or they weren't working well enough, because I had a band. And the band, I had this band called the Freight Elevator Quartet. This is what we looked like. This is us at the kitchen in like 1999. And what happened was I was touring with these machines, and because of the way they kind of worked, they weren't the most stable road gig equipment. So my favorite story was we were playing at this show, this club on Bleecker Street, this thing called the Elbow Room, that thank God is no longer there. And depending on whether the light switch was on in the women's room, my entire system would slow down. And it would slow down like a really like irritating musical interval, like a minor ninth or something like that. So it would be, I would be playing, and it would be like do 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 do, and someone would have to go pee, and then it'd be like right. And so that was like, and that wasn't a Buchla, that was a Surge, right? So there's something wrong with the voltage regulation. And I was just like, whatever. So I switched to a computer, and I switched to a computer right around the time Apple sort of started coming out with the third generation PowerPC chips, so you could do digital synthesis on a reasonably priced laptop in real time. And one of the other things that let us address was the fact that we were all of the opinion we were kind of boring to watch. So I had this band, we had a cellist, we had a didgeridoo player, we had a guy with a bunch of drum machines, and then I would play these synthesizers. And so what we started doing was we started incorporating like live video into the performances. And the first like test of this was pretty simple. All we did was we took a live camera, you know, and we embedded it, a radio camera with a wireless camera, and we would embed it in Nerf footballs and pass it out to the audience. So we would throw a Nerf football into the audience. And then what we would show them is something on the screen that kind of looks like this, right? So we'd pick up the video signal and do this. And I don't know if you can tell, but this is listening to me, right? It's reacting to my voice. And what it is, you know, this is one of these audio analysis things, right? Spectrum analyzer, right? So this is that thing on your car stereo, right? That you don't really understand why it's on your car stereo, but it's on your car stereo. And you know, you're really high late at night, you're like, that's the guitar, that one, right? So these are sort of low frequencies, these are high frequencies, right? And you got amplitude. And what it's doing is it's scrubbing a delay line, right? So it's got about 10 seconds of memory, and if a frequency is very loud, you see now, and if it's really quiet, you see 10 seconds ago. Makes sense? Pretty simple. But it's reactive, and it's really engaging, and it proves a couple things. One being that what is happening on stage is happening then and there and now, and it gives the audience a way to kind of feel like they're engaged with what's happening electronically on stage. And this is one of these things that, like, I think a lot about, you know, when working with electronic media or with technology, computers in live performance or in art, right? So there's there's a, I didn't use PowerPoint, I just typed stuff, sorry about that. There's a, one easy way to think about it is, we're pretty embedded in the kind of idea that you see these things on stage now. You see computers on stage, you see computers in art galleries. And there's a couple things you got to kind of figure out, right, when you're going to do it. One is, you can think of it as like a transparency opacity problem. That's one way I think of it. A computer is, in a way, a beautifully transparent device for an audience member because they own one too. It's not like a cello or a Bugler synthesizer, right? It's not some specialist piece of hardware. That leads to interactivity envy, right? Because you see somebody on stage with a computer and you're like, wait a minute, I have a computer. How come I'm not the person on stage, right? But at the same time, they're quite opaque, right? Because the computer's a general purpose instrument. It's not like a cello, right? So the person on stage could be checking their email, right? Or they could be doing their taxes, right? Everybody's done this. Anybody who does lots of live performance with laptop at a certain point is checking their email on stage, and that's just the way it is. If you want to sound smart about it, you use words in French, right? So another way to think of it is to think of it in terms of aesthetics, right? So jouissance and plaisir, right? Like these sort of map to the English words joy and pleasure, but they're a little bit more fine-tuned in the French language. Kogo Fusco, who's a buddy of mine, who's a performance artist at Columbia, sort of described this best. Plaisir is a really nice car, jouissance is having sex in the back of a really nice car. That's a useful kind of distinction. So a cello, right, is a jouissance item, or a painting, Picasso painting, right? A computer, regardless of what Apple's advertising tells you, is very much a plaisir item. So you have to sort of jump that hurdle first. And that's always what I'm sort of thinking about when I'm making these systems. And so visualizing the sound was kind of a first step, and then from there I sort of started thinking about ways to modify the sound and modify the image to make it more interesting. So this is something that's also listening to me. This is more like kind of weird psychedelic GL, right? So this is designed for a string quartet. It's sort of folded origami paper. It's trying to make a sort of pattern where it's detecting the rhythm of my voice. It's kind of doing this little paper folding thing based on the timbre of my voice. And that's all nice, but you can also sort of modify sound this way. So this is the kind of thing that seems like no big deal anymore, but when we were sort of working on Jitter in 2002, this was still not done as in a sort of performance context as much. So I'm going to talk to my computer for a second. My dog has fleas, testing 1, 2, 3. Do-do-do. And it's coming out the wrong speakers. Hold on a second. Now we hear it. There we go. So this is a sonogram, right? This is a pretty standard way to show a sound, right? So the red line is time. This is just like that camera thing I'm showing you. These are low frequencies, these are high frequencies. It's in this kind of faux 3D, right? So there's height of mountains and stuff. But the dirty little secret with this patch is it didn't record me, it just made the image. So it's just scanning back the image to make the sound. And that lets you do all these things you're not supposed to do, right? Like the red line. Like the red line doesn't have to move.
My dog has fleas.
Right, it frees time. This is a phase vocoder. And so I can play at any speed. I play backwards. And forwards. And fast. And really fast. Turn into an oscillator. Yeah.
Is it possible to take the image out of the program and then feed it back in?
Yeah. Yeah, I can save and restore and whatever. Yeah. Yeah. And it's not really an image, right? It's just data. Right? So it's like it's you think of it as in a kind of image metaphor, so that lets you say, well, this is a picture. I blur, I can blur it, right? Right, you get this.
Read it backwards.
Yeah, you can play backwards, you can do whatever you want. Yeah. The point is the red line doesn't have to move. As soon as you turn something right, this is like a domain switch, right? So as soon as you take a signal and you say, look, this is no longer something that's samples across time, but instead I'm going to take sort of photographs of chunks of it and I'm doing a Fourier transform, I'm turning it into this other representation. Then it's like a movie, right? When you play a movie slow, it doesn't change color in the same way that when you play a sound slow, it drops pitch, right? So you can do stuff like that pretty easily. And I thought this was kind of this is kind of a simple trick now, like Ableton Live does this like in 50 different ways when it's like matching beats and whatever. But at the time I was like, this is actually kind of a revelatory little trick where by transcoding the media into another domain, I can do something interesting with it. And so I started surfing around for things to do with it, right?
What was the time frame on that?
Like how long did it?
No, when did you?
Oh, we were working on Jitter in like 2000, 2001, something like that. Yeah. Yeah, it's not that you couldn't do this before, it's just you couldn't do it quite as expressively because the computer had to crank on it. You know, so like I had a phase vocoder on my next machine in college, and I would do things like try to take a piano sound and stretch it to last like 4 hours, and that would take like a week. Like my computer would just be like thinking for a week, and then I would play it, and I would be like, oh, I messed up, I forgot to like hit some setting, and then I have to run it for another week, and another, you know, so
But
it's
the
just,
Super Pulse stretch, it takes like 50 minutes.
yeah, now like there are these programs that just run on your computer, and it takes like no time at all. So I was interested in that stuff. And the first project that I got, or the first gig that I got to use this was the record label I was working with. This is going to sound like a totally weird story. The record label I was working with in New York decided to put out a Christmas album of remixes, of experimental remixes of Handel's Messiah.
That must have been Nunsuck. Is that Nunsuck?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I used to produce records for Nunsuch. So in Nunsuch,
Sandra York, remember Sandra York?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I worked for Bang on a Can, right? So I produced records for like Michael Gordon. And so they decided to do this, and so they reached out to like, I don't know, 14 or 15 experimental musicians in New York and they licensed like a professional, you know, studio recording of Handel's Messiah, and they said, this is, you know, this is your raw material, make us something, and it has to be 5 minutes or less, right? So we immediately got into this war over who was going to use which part of the thing, right? Everybody wanted to use, you know, like if you know this piece, like oddly enough, like the best known part of Handel's Messiah happens sort of 2/3 of the way through, right? It happens at kind of the golden mean of the piece. It's not at the end of it. It's called the Hallelujah chorus, right? And so everybody was like, we gotta use that. And I was like, So what I did was, if you remember that last little program, the red line can move at any speed. What I did was I took the whole damn thing and sped it up to 5 minutes. Because really, who has time to listen to an hour and a half of oratorio these days anyway? So I took the whole thing and went, and what happens is you lose some stuff. You lose rhythm at the micro level, and you lose melodies at the kind of local level. But you keep harmony. You keep like this kind of overall sense of harmony, and you keep timbre. Like you can sort of tell maybe that these are voices singing. And there'll be a bit in the moment where it'll break and you'll hear harpsichords, right? So you keep some of this like 30,000 foot view stuff. And this was a technique that I came up with, and I called it, like Ken introed it, like I call it time-lapse phonography, right? So the idea that you can do a long exposure photograph of a sound to tease things out, right? So these are harpsichords. And it was all about thinking about like, what's the last thing you hear? Or not the last thing you hear, but like what's the thing that's like ringing in your ears when you leave a musical experience? Is it the last thing you hear? Is it the first thing you hear? Is it the bit where you like smoke your drink on your date? What is it? Right? And so I always think of it as like it's this kind of gestalt thing that I'm trying to get to. And so I thought that was fun. And I started thinking of like things to do with this. So this is a project that I did where I took every #1 song and sped it up to 1 second for every week it was at #1. And it looks like this because it was originally installed on an iPod. And so this is, you know, the history of the American pop chart in 37 minutes or whatever. So the song lasted for 10 weeks at #1, it lasts 10 seconds, 1 week, 1 second. You're gonna hear the Chipmunk song in a minute. Chipmunk song. And so like musicologically this is kind of fun, like all of 1978's in the key of F. Right, just because the guys from the Bee Gees can kind of only sing one note, right? But if you grew up listening to pop radio, you have part of this memorized, right? You're like, you oh, I love that song, or oh, I hated that song, or oh, that song played at my prom, or I lost my virginity right there, or whatever. Like, you've got part of this. This is kind of like a cultural canon in the United States, whether you want it to be or not. Even if it's just its background noise in your life, it's still a noise and it's still there. And I thought this was an interesting way to kind of express that. I did a sequel to it for the Sundance Film Festival where I took every Best Picture, every Academy Award Best Picture, and made it 1 minute, strung them all together, right? So 75 movies in 75 minutes. Totally unwatchable. Totally unwatchable film.
Well-
Let me find something we might, that was it.
Watching.
Yeah, this is Casablanca, right? The whole movie's in there. It's not a time lapse. I'm doing like sort of a high quality average, moving average of the footage. So the sound and the image are all in there. Yeah, Ken.
Isn't there something where you also sort of slow down in each scene or scene change or something? Because it actually is very cleverly done. I sat and watched this for quite a while. I have to say,
And
I
you're
felt,
still here.
yeah, I know, because I actually thought I could get a sense of what these movies were that I never saw.
Yeah.
It
Well,
was amazing that way.
the thing that gets shown, the thing that really unveils itself when you do this is the editing strategy, right? It tells you a lot about the history of editing in American film or in film, right? So this still looks like Casablanca, right? This is legible, right? Rick still looks like Rick, Ilsa still looks like Ilsa, Paris still looks like Paris. If you fast forward to something from like the aughts, like this is in Chicago. In Chicago, I would, Chicago's a little harder to read, right? Right? They're the same length movies, so they're being sped up the same amount, right? They're both like hour and a half-ish long movies. So the acceleration's equivalent, right? But what it shows you is that like in the 1940s, right, they still shot the films like theater, right? So like if we were doing like a scene together, like the shots would be like 26 seconds. It would be like, we would do like 8 lines, you know, to each other before they move the camera. Nowadays, we shoot movies like music videos. The average length of a shot in Chicago is about 6 seconds, right? So when you speed it up, it changes. And there's pivot points in the acting too. So like before on the waterfront, the primary characters are always in focus because they tend to be pretty stable in the shot. After on the waterfront, the primary characters are in motion and the secondary characters are in focus. So that by the time you get to things like The French Connection, you can't even see Gene Hackman when you speed up his movie because he's always moving in his scenes, so he disappears, he vanishes. You only see the secondary characters, right? And I thought that was kind of interesting. And then to round it out, you know, I did this project that got me sued by Playboy, right? So I took every Playboy planet of the month and centered their eyes, right? So this is sort of time-lapse pornography. And it's also the history of airbrushing. And I was interested in these things because whether we like it or not, these things are lists, right? These things are, you know, you live in a country that has a extraordinarily irritating obsession with the idea of winning, and of being the best, and of being in a canon, right? Being number one. But the way in which these specific media are chosen is kind of interesting because it's pretty profoundly anti-democratic, right? You need, this is West Side Story. You need the collusion of several major multinational corporations to get the number one song, right? The Academy Awards are peer review, right? We never voted for West Side Story. A bunch of directors voted for West Side Story, and actors, right? Don't even get me started about Playboy, right? But you can see how this works, right? We sort of think that maybe the way in which we choose them is something that might be flawed. And I thought that, you know, using the computational media as a way to illustrate that was kind of fun and kind of interesting. I also have a bunch of projects that use, yeah, talk to me.
So when you did the Playboy thing over several years, did you see sort of a global shift in trend in something, hairstyle or makeup? Or,
Yeah, I mean, there are
or
trends
the
in
way they
hairstyle.
smile?
There are trends in hairstyle. There are also trends in the way they doctor the images, right? Because the images are always doctored. There's a technical evolution there, right? So you can see the moment they discover Photoshop. Everything really, you know, so whenever that, you know, sort of like 2002, everything really changes when they stop doing manual airbrushing. I was more interested in thinking of these pieces in the kind of discussion around canonicity. So like when you talk about Playboy, you can talk about things like the Westermark effect and how that relates to culture and culture and beauty. right? So like if you've sort of got a society where you're promulgating these very specific images as normative beauty, how does that kind of change, right, our affinities, right? And that's the real problem, right? It's not that those aren't necessarily beautiful women or not beautiful women, it's whose beautiful women are they and how are they pushed out, right? And it's the same thing with the movies, and it's the same thing with the songs, right? Playboy is arguably, like, is pretty definitively the worst case of that, but it's not the only case of that. So I was thinking about those things. And, you know, so I was sort of looking at these, like, 30,000-foot view things. Yeah, talk to me about it.
Did the lawsuit prevent you from allowing people to watch that work?
Yeah, it's not online. Yeah.
Not
Yeah,
online?
Playboy's an interesting company because sometimes they valorize Playboy-related art, and sometimes they sue people, and sometimes they ignore people. So there's an artist in Chicago named Jason Salavan who has a not dissimilar piece where he made these kind of high-resolution digital averages of Playboy centerfolds, including their bodies, the women's bodies, which is not really the point at all of my piece. So I didn't, that's why I concentrate on their faces. This is what they look like. These are hanging in the Playboy mansion, right? Hugh Hefner bought these, right? Somebody like Candace Brights, right, South African artist who did a bunch of like Rorschach test things based on Playboys, was sued, right, just like me. And then somebody like Martha Rosler, right, who has this very famous montage, Body Beautiful, from the 1970s, made out of Playboy images, like very like sort of marquee blue chip feminist artist, was ignored, right? So some people they sue, some people they ignore, some people they buy, depending on the rhetoric around their projects. Right? Yeah.
So fair use is changing, right? And one of the things that's really interesting is we're actually, Tiffany and I are working on a project right now, and we're pulling Hollywood films. My understanding is that if it's documentary and there's a commentary, then
Yeah.
it's okay up
Yep.
to a certain amount.
Yep.
But it's still somewhat gray. For your Hollywood one, was that considered
So the thing was, that was the thing I was expecting to get sued for, actually. I wasn't expecting to get sued for Playboy. I thought I was going to get sued over the Academy Award piece. I thought it was, because it was commissioned for Sundance, right? So I was sure it was going to be like this news item where it was like, in a stunning display of industry solidarity, every movie studio simultaneously sues me. Right? That was like what I was kind of assuming was going to happen. That's what I was going to assume. That was what I assumed would happen. But they actually didn't think of it that way. They thought of it as a Valentine, right? And there were so many copyright stakeholders involved, right? Because remember, like the inner two parts of the fair use 4-part test are kind of like the source dim and the destination dim of how you're using it, right? So how much of any given copyright holder are you acquiring, and how much of that ends up, what totality of your piece is made from that one place, right? It's pretty low in my case because 75 movies all are owned by different people. The person who had the most standing to sue me would have been Robert Redford, because he directed or acted in 10 Oscar-winning films, and he runs the Sundance Film Festival, right? So he would have probably had a case. He would have probably been able to say 17% of that film is me, right? So give me my money, right? But he didn't, right? He bought it, So that's so a lot of it depends. I mean, the thing is super wishy-washy. Like Pat Ofterheide has a really nice kind of like field guide for fair use, primarily not so much toward practicing artists, but toward people who work in art history and collections-based research, right? So like if you are Ofterheide, here, let me find. I can send it to you, but it was sponsored by the College Art Association, and there's a kind of like best practices guide that just came out a couple years ago around fair use in the fine arts. Most of their use cases are academic. So most of their use cases are, you are doing an art historical white paper on Picasso. What can you show of Picasso without running afoul of of Picasso's foundation or children, right? And what can reasonably be assumed to be fair use in that case for commentary. It's much more cut and dried in things like literature, right? If you're doing like an anthology, if you're writing a book, like an academic text about, I don't know, whatever, like 20th century American fiction, and you want to splice in a paragraph from like Goodbye Columbus, they can't really stop you. because you're using it as a basis for commentary. The hardest thing is especially within things like recorded music, we have no tradition of there being like an audio culture that's commentary on another audio culture, right? We don't really have that as strongly. So it's like, so I would say, that's exactly what artists like Negativland do, but they don't have the same like editorial, like je ne sais quoi that they've been like certified with, that like the College Art Association has, They're seen as like a bunch of cranks who make mashups, but they're actually, the level of critique they're doing is very high, but it's not valorized in the same way or authorized in the same way because of the way the institutions work. Yeah.
Yeah, well, sadly, De La Soul is not available on streaming media because of the copyright problems.
Mhm.
The studio will not go to trouble
Yeah.
to be certified, and they're upset about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's lots of stuff like that.
They're like the pioneers, and some of the pioneers were really popular with all this stuff, but it's not available on iTunes or Pandora or anything like that.
Yeah.
So they're missing a new generation
Yeah.
of artists.
Yeah, and there's a lot, there's lots of cases like that, and some artists have very strong opinions about protecting their digital rights, right? Like Prince, right, was hyper litigious, because he understood that, he had the right to his revenue, to control his revenue stream, or he believed that was like such an important part of that creative identity, and he'd been screwed so many times by his record label that he sort of took it into this space where they would go after people who would make fan movies on YouTube, right? But there's other people who don't care. Well, I'll show you, like later on, I'll show you a Britney Spears portrait. Like Britney Spears is reasonably, like pretty much care less what people do with her sounds, because it's a way to encourage fan base remixing. Well, no, but it's a way to encourage fan base remixing, right? And a lot of top 40 people kind of take that stance. They release acapellas of all their singles into the public domain so that people can make, and that's how a lot of artists are discovered, right? Like Pharrell Williams, right? Started out as basically like a basement remixer, and then he became a songwriter, and then, so he was discovered through that process, right? So that's how they sort of figured it out. I also have some projects that are like sort of a little bit more textual. This is a commission that I did. It's funny, the last time I was here was 8 years ago. You remember that, Ken?
Yeah.
It's like right before Election Day, 8 years ago.
That's right.
Yeah. Because we did the thing and then I got on a plane.
So what guys did you do wrong this time?
I know. I thought it was gonna work. I thought it would help.
So yeah, exactly. So in 2008, I got commissioned by the Democratic Party of the United States to do a piece for their convention, which was in Denver. The convention where Barack Obama was nominated to be his party's candidate for president. And the mission that they gave me, or that the curator gave me, was kind of vague. He was like, do something with words. And I was like, great. I was like, thanks, baby. So I was like, do something with words. So I was lucky in that I found this place at UCSB called the American Presidency Project, which is something that would now be characterized as a digital humanities archive. And what these folks were doing is they were taking the entire paper trail of the American presidency and sticking it into a computer, right? Everything back to George Washington, every speech, everywhere they went, every bill they signed, all that stuff. So you could sort of show up and ask them, how many times did Taft say donut? And they can tell you, right? And that was cool. So I sort of rolled up in the piece and said, I'm your artist in residence. And they said, we have no idea what that means, sit down, right? And so I spent, I had a long lead time on this. This was for 2008. This is like 2007. I had kind of a long lead time, so I spent like 2 weeks out there working with these folks. And I was really stuck, actually, because originally I was going to do something like a Billboard Hot 100 thing of things presidents say all the time, right? Like, God bless America, I'm not a crook, whatever, right? And then I was watching, you ever seen Crossfire on CNN? Do you remember this show? This was actually like probably the best thing Jon Stewart ever did in his life was get that show canceled, right? So this show was, to review, it was sort of pundits, right? So it was sort of two pundits from the American political right and two pundits from the American political left yelling at one another for an hour. And once in a while there would be a guest who would be quote unquote caught in the crossfire, right? One of the pundits from the American left who was kind of a staple during the George W. Bush administration was a guy named James Carville, who is Bill Clinton's domestic policy advisor, best known for coining the term "it's the economy, stupid." And so I was stuck on this project, and I was watching that show on repeat at like 3 in the morning. So you gotta imagine, I'm like in a Motel 6 in Santa Barbara at 3 in the morning in my underwear eating Cool Ranch Doritos, watching James Carville yell at Tucker Carlson, right? And James Carville was talking about George W. Bush, and the word he kept saying was vision, right? He said, problem with him is he doesn't have any vision, vision. And I'm like sitting there eating, I'm like, yeah, that's right. That's the word, right? That's the word you use to talk about leadership, whether or not they have vision. And the way you test someone's vision is you make eye charts, right? You test it with eye charts. And so what I did was I made an eye chart for every president of the United States. So this is something called the term frequency inverse document frequency. If you're like a stats person, you'll know what this is. But what this is showing you is the 66 words in this president's State of the Union addresses that they use more than any other president. So George Washington's #1 word is gentleman. George Bush, who was president when I made this piece, his #1 word is right? Bill Clinton spent most of his speeches talking about the century in which he would no longer be president, but maybe his wife would be, right? Some of these you can guess. So Ronald Reagan's deficits, right? Richard Nixon is truly. Richard Nixon's speechwriter was a singularly interesting man named William Safire, who was an amateur linguist, and he did word counts too. So he used statistics to tweak the rhetoric of his boss's speeches to hit home on themes that they felt conveyed the right things in the moment. So he sort of like invented the kind of sort of quasi-algorithmic approach to political speech writing in the United States.
Can you show us Kennedy?
Yeah, I'll show you Kennedy, yeah. I'll show you Lyndon Johnson first. Lyndon Johnson was the first president to give the speeches on primetime TV. So he began every paragraph with the word tonight, otherwise it would have been Vietnam, right? Yeah. Kennedy was not president for very many State of the Union addresses, so his would have been alliance, recession, cold. FDR gets all the good speeches because he gave 13 of these things, right? So he is Democratic. Let's see, Herbert Hoover is unemployment, right? Recovery major. Coolidge is veterans. That's the last time New Orleans flooded, right? So this is like a history lesson, right? Abraham Lincoln is emancipation, right? You can sort of imagine how this works, right? So I think of these as portraits, and this is where I started thinking of what I did as portraiture, right? So when you usually think about portraits, you think about things like Gilbert Stuart's Lansdowne portrait of George Washington, right? You think of an oil painting of somebody preferably on horseback or something like that, and there's lots of kind of standard symbolism, right? About there's a rainbow and there's a sword and there's a quill and all that stuff. And so this was a different kind of portrait.
Did you run that on Donald Trump's stump speeches?
I have a few other things that are related to Donald Trump. Yeah. But what this was it was a big sculpture, right? It's big light boxes. And they're to scale. So if you stand 20 feet back and you can read that line, you got 20 vision. So that's important. We also made letterpress versions of it. There were the RNC that are kind of 3/4 size. And this was like my sort of first project of American rhetoric, right? And I liked it, but it was also pretty limited because it wasn't, it wasn't particularly democratic. I mean, it was about the leadership. It wasn't really about us. So a couple years after that, I started surfing for a data set that was sort of ordinary Americans describing themselves, and what I settled on was online dating. And so 2010, I made a census in the United States where I joined 21 different online dating services. I have obsessive compulsive disorder. So I joined 21 different online dating sites. As a straight man and gay man, straight woman and gay woman in every zip code in America, and downloaded everybody. So I downloaded 19 million people. So I downloaded about 20% of the adult single population of the United States to a hard drive, which I thought was a pretty decent representative sample. And I did the exact same trick. I mean, except instead of it being about time, right, instead of it being a temporal map, it's a spatial map. And so I made maps. So this is where all the funny people are. Nebraska's not very funny. This is where all the lonely people are. People tend to say they're lonely in Appalachia.
So when you associate these words with people, is that the
Yeah, I have everybody sorted by zip code. I know what zip code they live in. Right?
Do they use these words in their profile? Like they describe themselves
Yeah.
as?
It's how people describe themselves.
Yeah.
So online dating has had this real sea change in the last 10 years, right? So it's gone very rapidly from being something you're slightly uncomfortable admitting to doing to being something that's actually like a social exercise you do in a mobile space in a bar with friends, right? So it's really, really changed, right? So like if you want, like a really funny sort of like early example of that is something like the movie Sneakers, if you've ever seen that movie from like 1990, right? There's a subplot involving enrolling people in a computer dating service to try to track this guy, and everybody's so embarrassed at the thought of having to go on a computer date that it's like completely stigmatized. Now it's totally normal. But when I made this in 2010, the dominant online dating services were still kind of textual. It was like Match.com, which is an IAC property. So unlike Tinder, where you can really focus on the pictures, in Match.com you still had to describe yourself. You had to write like a paragraph about you and a paragraph about the person you wanted to date. So in the first one you lie, and in the second one you tell the truth, right? You know, so like and so you use these words. So these are where all the shy people are. This is a kinky map. What this is telling you is that you know, men in southern New Mexico should get together with women in Alaska and have a good time. And I did the exact same trick that I did with the eye charts, but looking at cities. There are every single city in the United States with a word people use more in that city than anywhere else. So if you dated anyone from Seattle, this makes perfect sense. Right? We got Heartbreak and Pretty, right? They like play in a band, right? They fucking smoke, right? I mean, this all makes sense, right? This is Redmond, Washington, which is the headquarters of Microsoft Corporation, right? And you know, you can guess what some of these are, right? Los Angeles is acting, because of course it is. You know, this is where we are, right? Right, so that makes sense, right? Seems plausible to me. I grew up somewhere in New Jersey, kind of between annoying and cynical. Right? But some of these are sort of more heartbreaking, right? So like folks in Washington, D.C. say they're interesting, right? Folks in Baltimore say afraid. People in you know, Baton Rouge, Louisiana will say curvy, right? So their number one word is, the number one word that shows up for them is curvy, but folks downstream in New Orleans will still talk about the flood, right? So it sort of gives you a sense of what also is on people's mind. New York City's number one word overall is now, right? And now, which is like a very common phrase in New York, actually. You know, the expression, you know, now I'm working as a waiter, but actually I'm an actor, right? That's like how you would express that, right, in an online dating context. If you go uptown, though, if you go upstate, sorry, you get stuff like this, right? So Syracuse, New York is dinosaur, because the only good place to eat in Syracuse, New York is a Hell's Angels barbecue joint called Dinosaur Barbecue. So that's where you would take someone on a date, right? So this sort of gives you a sense of how that works. And you can go down to the zip code level in some cities. So I have a zip code. I have a zip code thing in the Bay. It's a little hard to read, but it can sort of give you a sense.
94720.
Exactly. So this gives you sort of a sense of some of the words around here. Right? We're over here. So it's good stuff. Bilingual, folksy, silkscreen. And all these words are unique, so it's a modification of the TF-IDF algorithm that works on very tiny margin calls, right? So if I was just looking at the most popular word, right, it wouldn't be as interesting. Every word would be love, and Los Angeles would be sex, right? That's how that would work, right? I ran it, and that's exactly what came out, right? So but if you look at this, you get these really specific things, right? Which unveils a pretty profound statistical flaw, because what that means is that if there's a town in Iowa that only has 4 single people, and one of them really likes snowboarding, that means 25% of the town likes snowboarding. And they're gonna get that word, right? So it's not meant to really be accurate in any sort of way. I don't really think of what I do as, I mean, I think my stuff has the same relationship that, you know, to social science as science fiction has to science, right? So it's a little bit more, it's a little bit looser than that. I've also done self-portraits. These are all my emails. This is like a quantified selfie, right? So this is if you take 500,000 emails and you run them through a physics simulation of affinities. So what you do is you start with a big bang here. Everybody flies off at a random angle, and then everybody has gravity to one another based on how they were carbon copied, how long they were carbon copied, how much how much email transpired in those carbon copies. But I also did sentimental analysis. So if I say I love you, you're heavier to me, right? You're closer into me. And so these are all the, you know, people who I've written to the most, and I hand wrote all their names, right? Yeah.
Have you thought about animating that, both
Yeah.
in terms of the process for how it settles out, but also how it evolves over time?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a smart, that would be like a smart like phase 2 thing to do. I really wanted to make a print. Like I wasn't thinking animation, I was thinking like I was gonna draw, never do this at home, this was like such a pain in the ass, but like, you know, I hand drew using a slide projector as an overlay, like 5,000 names on a digital print, right? On like a 6x6 digital print. But yeah, a cooler and definitely easier thing to do would have been time lapses and look at like how my email changes. You know, I started using email probably in 1993. Maybe. All of those people are kind of tucked over here because I had a different email address in college, right? So like these are, you know, all. Let me see if I can find them. Yeah, these are all my friends from college, like in a different part of the map. Do you know what I mean? Who I don't speak to anymore. But there was a moment when they were super central, right? And so how things have shifted is actually really interesting to me too, for sure. Yeah. And I've got a Facebook version that's kind of like the same idea, right? It's all like Facebook friends, and the people in the outer periphery are the people who have no common friends with you. So those are like friends of yours from elementary school that you haven't talked to for 25 years. And then you have these kind of like, you know, super dense clusters around, you know, like this is somewhere in here is a guy named Todd Reynolds, who's a violinist I'm friends with in New York, who's friends with like fucking everybody, right? And somewhere in here is, yeah, I have this art star former student interest in Parrish, who's also friends with everybody, so you can sort of find these people. But you know, not all of them are quite fun and games. So I'll just show you a couple of new things I'm working on. This is a fun one. So this is a Walther PPK 9mm semi-automatic that was used in a shooting in the French Quarter in New Orleans 2 years ago on Valentine's Day, in an argument over parking right here. So what happened was somebody cut somebody else off to get at this parking space, and then they shot each other dead, killed each other. And so it was what the police euphemistically refer to as a zero-sum crime, right? The victims and the assailants are, you know, cancel one another out, and so there's no need for anything other than a you know, modest brief investigation, and then you cut it, and so that means the gun is no longer evidence. So I was able to get it. This is a barbecue joint I ate at. This is the hardware store I had to go to like 5 times to find a hard to find drawer. And so this is an Internet of Things piece, right? You all know what that means, right? So Internet of Things. Internet of Things is like a misleading name. Usually there's no internet, there's no thing, but in this case there is. So I got this little bike chain, I got a little stepper motor. This is my lame attempt at engineering. And you take the gun, you drill a hole in the trigger, and you weld it down to a big metal plate. It's my buddy Cole, who knows how to spot weld. Then you go home for the night, then you get attacked by a rooster. And then what you do is you take this whole mechanism, you stick it inside a box with a little wire going up through the gun, yeah? And you put the whole thing in a vitrine, like a glass box, right? And the computer that's in there with the motor is online. And so Eric Holder, who was, you know, President Obama's first Attorney General, passed this regulation early on in his administration, saying that any city with more than 100,000 people in it by law has to have an open data feed for crime. Do you know about this? So any city with, you know, a certain number of people, you have to be, you as a citizen have to, by law, be able to get all the shootings, all the assaults, all the whatever, time-stamped, geocoded as they happen, right? So I can listen to any city. And so the way this works is, I had this in New Orleans, and anytime someone was shot in New Orleans, it would fire, right? So it would do that, right? Right, so it's blanks, no bullet, right? There's a bullet, there's a slug, right? But there's a cartridge, right? Big flashing noise in a cartridge. So there were 5 shootings a day in New Orleans. So I had this up for 3 months. So this filled up with cases. Right? This is called data visualization, right? You guys have heard this, right? And data visualization sucks. And this is sort of a demonstration of why it sucks. Right? So data visualization is this really fantastic thing in the sort of inside track world of applied statistics and research and all sorts of amazing things where it helps us sort of get a glimpse of how a trend is going, and we can do all sorts of amazing things with it. The problem I've noticed in the last 10 years or so is that as soon as it's gotten pushed out into public-facing journalism, it's under-problematized. We're starting to use bar graphs instead of photographs in newspapers when we're talking about bad things. Not even bad things, it doesn't matter. When we're talking about people, when you're talking about people, you should not be using bar graphs, you should be using photographs. And so this whole scenario is about kind of confronting the viewer with this kind of shitty, heartbreaking fact, which is that when you walk in and see it, and once you read what it's about, part of you is disappointed if you leave the gallery and the gun doesn't go off. Right? Because you didn't get the payoff. Even though you know what the payoff is, the payoff means somebody got shot. Right? So this has been touring the country. Right?
You have to reload it every 2 days?
I have to reload it every morning. 5 shootings a day, I only got an 8 gun clip. I only got an 8 bullet clip. So a PPK, right? The clip's in the butt. So you just flip it out and put it in. It's a very popular handgun for women, so all the women who worked in this gallery owned that gun and knew how to reload it, right? Because it's light, it's polycarbonate handle, it doesn't have much of a recoil, fits in your purse. It's good. It's good. It's not just a James Bond gun. It's the number 2 or number 3 selling handgun for women in the United States. It's a self-protection weapon. So that's one of the reasons I picked it. But it's you know, so that was sort of like what I was thinking about. Yeah, you have to reload it. It's been touring the country. I had it in a public library in Ferguson, Missouri for a while. Right now it's at the New America Project in Washington, D.C. It's going to be in Chicago in the spring. And I can listen to any large city, so I can do it here. They probably wouldn't let me do it here. The gun, I can't do it in New York. The gun possession restrictions are such that it's really hard to have possession of a live firing weapon for like an off-brand use, like art, right? In a city context.
Like we're doing acoustical testing, that's one way you can get.
Yeah, sure. I could do it. Yeah, exactly. I could tell them I was doing impulse responses. Yeah, sure. Yeah, the impulse response defense, I think, is underutilized. Like, you know, like I'm really surprised Phil Spector didn't try that.
We were a little stunned where I work, how easy it is to use the impulse response defense to carry weapons on tanks.
Sure. Yeah, but I mean for a murder, right? Like Phil Spector shot an actress. He's a record producer.
All right,
His defense should have been that he was trying to sample the acoustics of the space, right? Like, you know, that would have been, you know, he could have had half of Sony as a to testify that that's how they do it. Yeah.
But if she'd screamed, it'd be copyright law.
Yeah. But this is the thing with this piece. So this has been sort of touring around, and I have a whole series of pieces about it, like sort of related to this that are called hard data. They're sort of looking at how data can hurt, right? That these numbers can hurt. And I have a string quartet about the Iraq War. It's kind of the same idea. There's a measure of music for every month of the war. 50 people got killed that day. The string quartet has to play 50 notes. I've done similar kind of like open score projects around gun violence in the United States. And so that's a sort of thing I've been doing for a while. So this is touring now.
Is this one also called hard data? Or what's
Yeah, this piece is called Take a Bullet for This City. And I did it with a buddy, you know, so the guy who commissioned this is a buddy of mine in New Orleans named Jonathan Ferrara, who is an art gallerist in New Orleans, but he's also an artist. And this is a little bit of an anniversary. So in 1994, the recently deceased Janet Reno, right, passed another regulation saying every city in the United States had to standardize their crime reporting. So it wasn't about open data feed, it was just about data, right, about like sort of better articulating how we're describing crime. And so 1994 was the first year where the sentence, the most dangerous city in America is ... had an answer that was sort of statistically validated by the Justice Department of the United States. And the answer was New Orleans. And so a bunch of artists in New Orleans did this pretty well-known social practice show called Guns in the Hands of Artists, where they took all their guns and used them to shoot up canvases or bend them into sculptures or whatever. And so I made this as a for the 20th anniversary of that exhibit, right? So we did this in 2014. Yeah.
This is I think I know the answer to this.
Ah.
Has anybody ever asked you, said, okay, we got all this data, and it's graphs, and we get the problem. We'd like you to reverse it and make it live.
Make it live.
Make it live. The
Oh,
way.
yeah, yeah.
Have people asked you to do that?
Once in a while. Yeah, I'm working with this guy, Jamil Jabbar. He used to be the head of the American Civil Liberties Union right now. Something that's a little bit kind of in that same vein. We're sort of trying to look at some of their public data sets and figuring out a way to make an API almost for things like hard data, like sort of culturally impactful data, where artists can sort of tap their data sources, right, and use it to make projects that then can be used for local fundraising. So the big thing I do with all these projects, right, is I raise money.
Yeah.
So this is actually my second project. This was actually the second project I did in New Orleans. The first project was significantly more uplifting. I did a crazy marching band piece where I got 350 high school kids to do a parade. And it's based on a project by Charles Ives, sort of early 20th century American composer, that was unrealized at his death. And what he imagined was a piece for marching bands synchronized by radio at a distance. So the idea was like, what if you got 10 huge brass bands, stuck them all over Indianapolis, and then used an AM radio tower to keep them in sync, right? So that's what I did. So what I did was there was a park, and there's a house on the park. I'll show you how the project worked. So there's a park called Washington Square. This is the Marigny, which is a residential neighborhood north of the French Quarter in New Orleans. This is called Washington Square. There's a woman who lives in a house right here named Deborah Luster, who's a former crime scene photographer for the Times-Picayune, and I stayed in her house, and she has these huge silver gelatin prints of dead people all over her house. It scared the shit out of me. But whatever. But she let me set up a radio tower on her roof, because fuck it. And what I did was I got 5 different high school marching bands to perform this thing where they started out in teams like a mile apart, and all the drum majors had a click track, right? So they're all in sync, but it's an unwatchable performance, right? There's no way to experience it live. Like you can sit in the park and it's like a surround sound thing. They come in one at a time, or you can follow one of the bands like a second line and you miss the other 80% of it, right? So what I did was I got. Y'all ever seen the show Treme? It's an HBO show. I got them to pro bono their day. I got the film crew from Treme to film it. Right? So I had a 60-person professional film crew following the bands and filming it. And what we did was we made this charity DVD. We made this DVD of all the kids doing their thing to raise money. And I wrote the music, and I spent 2 years down there working with these kids. Specifically these kids, these are middle school kids who were the beneficiary of the project. Their organization is called the Roots of Music, and it's an after-school program for at-risk youth in middle school to get them into high school bands. Because high school band music in New Orleans is a really great way to get a full college scholarship to like a Big Ten school. Right? Those kids go to like University of Michigan or UIUC or Michigan State or Indiana. Right? And so, this was a project, and so we raised like $68,000, I think, 5,000 DVDs. And so that's what I'm more interested in, is this kind of cultural placemaking. So the gun thing was, was auctioned off for a victims fund, right? I've done projects around a lot of it's around just sort of like pushing back against American cultural heterogeny, right? So this is another portrait that I did. This is in Sarasota, Florida. It's retired circus performers. So Sarasota is the home of the American circus. This is where the Ringling family was. And so circus performers tend to retire there. Circus performers are a bit like professional athletes. They tend to get retired at 30, but most of them never went to high school. So what do? So one thing you can do is you can find this guy. His name's Pedro Reyes. Pedro Reyes is a retired circus performer. He was an aerialist in the Big Apple Circus in the United States. And in the 1980s, he fell 36 feet without a net, broke every bone in his body. And he started this organization called the Circus Arts Conservancy that does oral history stuff to support the American circus. They run a local one-ring circus. They run the nation's largest children's circus program. But they're also a workforce development agency. So when you get retired at 30 as a juggler, you go find Pedro and he says, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he helps you get a job. This guy in Texas, Jack Fulbright. This is Gina Cristiani. So I did these portraits. And what they are is they're circus performers doing their things, but they're filmed in super slow-mo. They're filmed at 240 frames a second. So you see the physics of the juggling or the rope work or whatever, right, kind of unfold, right? So this is the sort of like the whip kind of thing. So Texas Jack Fulbright's a local football coach, but he was given an exemption from the Vietnam draft to do USO work because he was an amazing like Texas rope guy. And I was just really impressed by these people. These people are amazing because they're basically like movie stars who don't need a movie. Like they do everything perfect every time. And so I've been doing like portraits like that. I've done some stuff with the Weymouth Burroughs Foundation, same idea in Lawrence, Kansas. So yeah, do all sorts of stuff. I don't think what else I could show you.
No, we should, unfortunately, we should wrap it up, but
Okay.
I loved everything you showed, and I think I speak for everyone in the room. We want to thank you for that.
And I've got this show, where is that? What neighborhood?
It's called Minnesota. It's in Potrero Hill. It's across the bridge. It'll be up for how long?
Like a while, I think, like a month or
It's a
something.
month.
like
Good.
that,
Yeah, if you haven't been there, it's a really great new space for media art. Right on the Minnesota Street, right down by 18th and Minnesota or something.
Yeah.
17th.
What's the piece, or what's the show?
You know, it's a group show. And it's a group show celebrating the 15th anniversary of this gallery I work with in New York called Bitforms. So I think there's like 15 artists in them in that show. Some of them are really great. There's a guy named Danny Rosen, makes these physical mirrors. Really cool woman named Addie Vagonet, who does this kind of like, you know, kind of feminist critique of telecommunications and surveillance culture. So she'll make like chandeliers out of surveillance cameras and these crazy like woven threaded Cat6 wiring cables and such really beautiful stuff. There's a woman named Sarah Ludi, who does these like very sensual like 3D renderings. Listen, there's a guy named Rafael Lozano Hemmer, is a Mexican artist who does really interesting stuff, kind of interactive. There's a bunch of folks. I haven't seen it yet. I landed last night, so I haven't actually gone there and see what the hell it is. But I've seen photos of the install. And then if you end up in New York and you come before December, I have a show up in New York based on voting machines, old mechanical voting machines that are used as storytelling.
Hey guys, if we want to continue, let's go and we can talk with Luke individually, but we should break up because I know some people have stuff to do. And I think
You got a class in here.
we don't want to overstay our welcome.
Thank you.